What's up, guys? March 11th, 2018. This is Counterculture episode 21. Thanks for joining me. If you are watching the Facebook rebroadcast, this time I promise it will start at around, I should say, the 2-minute mark. So it's currently 11:38 p.m. My clocks still say 10:38 because I haven't changed my clocks yet. What's up, George? Hey, do you want to come on camera, bro? I can add you. Leave a comment, George. Say what's up. It's fall time, bro. That's why the leaves are falling. Back to the traditional black coffee. Lost my sunglasses there when I drank the coffee. Look at that again. So you guys didn't know I was cross-eyed. Check this out. We're also streaming live on Periscope today. We've tried the Periscope experiment a few times. Gonna get started here in 1 minute. Just waiting for a couple people to join us. So like I said, if you're watching the Facebook rebroadcast, please look around minute 2. That's when we're going to get started. And the reason I do this is because if I start right away, I don't get as many people to join me in the beginning. So they kind of join mid-conversation and don't know what the heck is going on. All right, I think it's been almost 2 minutes. So let's figure out how to turn off this stuff here. All right. Welcome. Today is March 11th, 2018. You are listening to Counterculture. I am your host, Aaron Lujan, and today's title of today's podcast is Gun Control Supporters Argue the NRA represents gun manufacturers. That's untrue, and if it were, who cares? Sorry for the super long title, guys. I couldn't figure out a way to shorten it, but essentially what I wanted to talk about today was what I had promised to discuss in the last episode. And by the way, this is Counterculture. We are streaming live on Facebook. We're streaming live on Periscope. This is being recorded as a podcast. You can catch the podcast on Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher, all the major podcast players. Counterculture, episode 21. Gun control supporters argue the NRA represents gun manufacturers. That's untrue. And if it were, who cares? Last episode, I said that I was going to dedicate the next couple episodes to discussing or addressing specific arguments that gun control proponents are proposing, because in the last episode I am sincerely wanting to meet people in the middle to be able to protect our children and try to bring an end to mass shootings while respecting the other side's opinions. So for years I've been asking people who are in support of gun control what specific policies. And one of the things that have been coming up a lot lately is how the NRA is to blame. The NRA is under attack. The National Rifle Association, which is one of arguably the most powerful lobby groups in the United States of America, they have anywhere between 4 to 5 million members strong. One of the most powerful in the sense that whatever they lobby for usually gets done. And as a result of the recent shootings in Parkland-Florida and all calls for gun control, the NRA has entered the targets of people who are calling for gun control. We've heard at the CNN town hall meeting, I believe about 2 weeks ago, Marco Rubio and Dana Loesch and all of these gun control opponents were asked by parents and students, will they continue to accept money from the NRA. The NRA is the villain. We're hearing that Daily Beast, blood-soaked gun lobby, is one of the ways they describe the National Rifle Association. Just recently, the governor of Connecticut called it a terrorist organization. Politicians are paid off by the NRA. And the narrative that we're hearing from the media and from gun control supporters is that it's because the NRA is in bed with gun manufacturers that they are able to pay off politicians, which is the reason why we can no longer protect our children and advance common sense gun control. And if this violent, evil, terrorist organization, the National Rifle Association, would just stop protecting gun manufacturers and thinking about profit and gun sales, that maybe we would finally be able to protect our kids. And so as a result, Delta Airlines, United Airlines have cut off discounts for NRA members. MetLife, the insurance company, is no longer providing discounts to NRA. The rental car companies, Enterprise, Alamo, National, no longer giving discounts to the NRA. Wyndham Hotels as well. And we're just hearing it nonstop from CNN and all the usual suspects on how NRA is awful. Well, I would like to begin this by identifying what the NRA actually does. If it's true that this allegation that they're supporting gun, or that they're working for the interests of gun manufacturers, is an actual true statement, if it's a fair assertion, and why it's all untrue. Well, that's how I want to begin, and then go into how it's untrue, and then end by saying even if it were true, it doesn't even really matter. So the National Rifle Association actually started in the late 1800s after the end of the Civil War, in order to promote marksmanship and general just supporting the sport and training people. And it wasn't really until the 1930s that they started to pivot to as an advocacy group and started distributing literature to educate people about potential threats to the Second Amendment. And they weren't necessarily lobbying at the time. They were educating people on some of the things that were coming down the pipe that were going to potentially affect Second Amendment. And it wasn't really until at that point that it truly became a political lobby and started defending the Second Amendment. And it's important to frame the NRA as to what exactly is it. It's actually a civil rights organization. That's a fact. The Second Amendment, like the First Amendment, are in constitutional rights. In America, my right to speech is protected by the law of the land, and so is my right to bear arms. So as a civil rights organization, they are there to defend what is already protected and codified by law. So that leads us to exploring the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment doesn't give people rights. It prohibits the government from infringing on natural rights that the founders argued were given to us by God. They are natural rights. They pre-exist government. That your right to life is not granted to you by the almighty state or the government. That was the inspiration and philosophy, the bedrock behind the Second Amendment. That rights are not derived by government, that they're natural rights. They're rights that you are born with. The right to life, the right to speech. And so the founders thought so highly of the Second Amendment that it was enshrined and essentially is there to prohibit government from infringing on it based on the fact that it is a natural right. And so the National Rifle Association is a civil rights organization there to advocate and protect and defend those rights. That is the role in the nature of the NRA that is not debatable. You just go to their Wikipedia page or go to the About Us. It's all there. It never was set up by gun manufacturers, at least the genesis of it. And I would also argue, or let me begin by saying, I am actually not a member of the National Rifle Association, and nor do I even believe that the NRA is the best gun rights group. From a personal standpoint, I would argue that the Gun Owners Association, the GOA, is arguably a much better civil rights group when it comes to defending the Second Amendment. And the reason I say that is the NRA doesn't have a really good record from the viewpoint of actual gun owners and those who believe it's important to defend our Second Amendment rights. Specifically, they signed off on the 1968 Gun Control Act. They were lobbying for gun control in the 30s. They haven't really been very good, but they're under the radar because they are the biggest and the most powerful. So I share that with you because I'm not like this rabid NRA defender because I'm a member, because I have a dog in the fight necessarily. Although I do have a dog in the fight because you know that I believe in the right to self-preservation and defense, and I believe in the founders' intent of the Second Amendment. But I'm not a NRA member. I'm not Dana Loesch. So I just simply want to address this issue because we're hearing this repeatedly in the media about how the NRA is this villainous group who is just interested in defending profits and only making money. So we've established that the NRA is a civil rights organization there to defend the Second Amendment. If government infringes on those rights, it's enshrined in the Declaration of Independence that gives us the right to alter or abolish our own government. And it would be impossible to abolish or alter the government without having firepower. There is a necessity to be able to bear arms if our founding documents were intended to put us in a position to be able to abolish or alter the government if they ever infringed on our rights, especially the most sacred ones, which is the first and the second, the right to speech and the right to life, and be able to defend oneself. So the point I'm trying to make in all this is that the NRA doesn't lobby politicians and say, hey, politician, we'll give you money if you just, represent us and push us. It's actually quite the other way around. Politicians need to lobby for the Second Amendment. I mean, they're in office. They swore an oath to protect and defend the Constitution. So the way that a lot of people who deal in the realm of facts, when they look at the relationship between the NRA and politicians, is it's very obvious and simple. It's a civil rights organization there to ensure that those people who swore to defend the Second Amendment are actually doing their job. Unlike, let's take it, an example. I got one, Planned Parenthood, where it actually flies in the face of the intent of our founding documents, which is right to life. Planned Parenthood breaks moral laws and legal code by murdering children, and we have Planned Parenthood spending millions of dollars lobbying for politicians to take tax dollars to subsidize abortions. That's buying off politicians when you give them money to do something that isn't necessarily in their right, nor do they have an obligation to do so. Politicians, senators, congressmen who represent us are there because they swore an oath to protect and defend the Constitution. So why do we look at a civil rights organization that holds them accountable to what they said they would defend and then turn around and say that they're lobbying politicians? That doesn't make any sense. It would make sense if that right wasn't enshrined in the Constitution. However, whether you like it or not, if you disagree with the Second Amendment and its intent, it still doesn't change the fact that the NRA is not lobbying politician, and that's the narrative that we're hearing in the mainstream media, that the NRA has all this blood money and that they're lobbying politicians to do their bidding, when it's actually the opposite. They're there to protect law-abiding citizens. never once in history has the NRA publicly or privately endorsed or supported crime. In fact, if you look at the organization, they actually have groups set up where they give money to schools and they train people on gun safety. It's actually quite the opposite when you look at it. But we continue to frame the NRA as this nefarious, money-motivated group that lobbies for the gun industry to sell guns. So let's look at that statement. Is it true that the NRA is lobbying for gun manufacturers? Because if it is true, then it gives people the impression that politicians are ignoring dead children and that they would rather preserve the profits of gun manufacturers. So it ties in to this neat narrative that it's the greedy Republicans who are taking blood money at the expense of dead kids so that they could help the NRA, because the NRA represents people who make guns so that they can make a lot more profit. I find that interesting because no one ever makes that argument, conservatives or liberals, when we expand the defense budget and send our troops overseas, because those are the billion-dollar deals. I mean, you compare what gun sales in the U.S. compared to what the U.S. government spends on weapons of war, it's not even close, guys. So what we're looking at is a situation where the media and the Parkland High School students are telling you that the NRA works for the gun industry. So let's look at the numbers, because the devil is in the details and the numbers don't lie. The NRA generally, I think most estimates, generally speaking, have about 4 to 5 million members to its organization, paying $25 a year, I believe. I don't know if that's a year or a month, but I believe that's a year, because if you take the lower estimate of 4 million members times 25, it's conservatively $100 million revenue, $100 million worth of revenue coming into the organization. Now, the media will say things like what this recent Democratic politician said, which in a speech about gun control recently, which is about half of the money that gets into the NRA's coffers are corporate donations. Again, a statement that is suggesting that they represent gun manufacturers. And most of this data is coming from a group called the Violence Policy Center. And if you read the document, and I've read the document, corporate donations is what they're terming it. Since 2005 has been anywhere from $19.5 to $52.6 million through 2011. And again, they do a really good job at not highlighting the fact that it was not an annual number, that it was, they're basically implying that this is from 2005 to 2011, that the NRA received corporate donations to the tune of anywhere from $19.5 to $52.6 million. Now, if you break that down per year, if you annualize that, that's an estimate of 2.8 million to 7.5 million annually of money that's not coming from their members, but coming from corporate donations. So the implication by the Democratic congressman, I believe, is that these corporate donations is the blood money. It's the money from Smith & Wesson and Ruger and Beretta and all of these gun manufacturers. Well, if you compare that number, assuming that that's where the money's coming from these evil gun manufacturers, that pales in comparison to the $100 million that it brings in from individuals paying $25 a month. So we got 100 million over here coming from 4 to 5 million independent people who all agree on a 200-year-old plus document that we have a right to life and liberty and the right to defend it. And according to the Violence Policy Center, which is the source of most of what the Democratic politicians and the mainstream media is quoting. And if you have another source, please bring it to me, because I've done a lot of digging and that is all I can find as far as best estimates on where the revenue from the NRA comes from. So you have the 100 million over here coming from individuals, and you have the 2.8 to 7.5 million coming annually from the quote unquote corporate donors. Now, it's important to define. So my point is, it's a drop in the bucket. It's obviously not the implication that the media and some of these politicians that are calling for gun control are trying to imply, which is that there's most of the money that's coming into the pockets of the NRA is somehow coming from gun manufacturers who just want to sell more weapons. So allow us to define corporate donations and the firearm industry. Well, this amount of money actually came from a program called the Roundup program, where if you would go into a gun store and you were purchase ammunition or a firearm, certain dealers that were participating with this NRA program called Roundup, they would round up the total to the next dollar, and they would give the difference to a specific fund managed by the NRA that was designated for primarily community programs, okay? Gun safety, gun advocacy, things that weren't necessarily for lobbying, although it very well could have been. Let's just give the gun control proponents the benefit of the doubt and say that it was. Because in my estimation, it doesn't make a difference where the money went. The reality is that these corporate donations and the firearm industry that your Democratic politicians and your mainstream media are calling were actually individuals that were just rounding up their totals to the next dollar, and then that money was then classified and designated as corporate donations from the firearm industry, which is actually kind of dishonest because it implies that it came from gun manufacturers, but in reality it was coming from individuals, but it was classified as corporate donations from the firearm industry because the money hit the NRA immediately from some of these gun dealers and some of these groups who were involved in the Roundup program. And it's also, I would be remiss not to mention, some of this money did actually come from actual gun manufacturers. So NRA had a program called the Golden Ring of Freedom, and between 2005 and I think 2011, we had 1 million given by Smith & Wesson. We had Beretta that gave 2 million, Ruger 1.25 million in a matching program. So if individuals gave $1, they gave $1. And again, most of this money, according to the NRA, and let's assume that they're lying, for argument's sake, didn't go to community programs, but they said it did. But let's assume that they're lying for a second, and the money didn't, and it just went to lobbying. That's 2 million from Beretta, 1 million from Smith & Wesson. Guys, 4 to 5 million members, each giving $25 a month. Okay, we're talking minimum $100 million coming into the organization every year. Beretta 2 million one time between 2005 and 2011. Smith & Wesson 1 million. I mean, we're talking like less than 1% of NRA's revenue. The devil's in the details. Do your research. Guys, I just explained to you the funding of the National Rifle Association. So the next time you hear these talking heads on CNN saying that the NRA is a terrorist organization that's lobbying for the gun industry, they're lying to you. Do your own research. Read where the money comes from. It's simple arithmetic. You guys, it took me about 20 to 30 minutes of research to be able to get to the bottom of this. Left-wing groups like the Violence Policy Center, because they can't really lie overtly, are fudging the numbers when they say that since 2005, corporate donations were between 19.5 to 52.6, and then call corporate donations the Roundup program, which was individuals just rounding up their totals at the gun store to give to the NRA, which the NRA said they gave to community programs. So the bulk of the money, guys, comes from individuals who believe in the sanctity of the Second Amendment. If you disagree with the Second Amendment, if you want to repeal it, that's one thing. But to call the NRA a terrorist organization that's taking blood money from gun manufacturers is hype. It's a conspiracy theory. It's tinfoil hat talk. It's not true. And this is coming from a guy that's not a big fan of the NRA. I'm not even a member, guys. I'm actually going to join the GOA, which is the Gun Owners Association, which is arguably a much better group. So I'm just trying to deal in the realm of facts. So if you're going around saying that the NRA is a terrorist organization that's really, really bad, it's based in fantasy land, guys. And I challenge anybody to present evidence that would suggest otherwise. So my last point in all of this is, let's assume that everything that I just said was all, I call BS. I'm sorry, guys, I can't help myself. Let's assume it's all BS. All the money, all $100 million comes from Smith & Wesson, Ruger, Beretta, etc. And the gun manufacturers really just want to sell more guns, which is the reason why we want to stop any further gun control, because it would just hurt our pockets. Let's assume that that's true. My whole point is, who cares? And let me explain why. The Second Amendment is a legal protection. It's not a goodie from the government, okay? My right to say whatever the hell I want to say is protected by the First Amendment. If what I was doing in majority of the countries in the world, I would be in jail right now, probably getting tortured. And I get to sit up here in Facebook Live and say whatever I want to say because I live in a country that protects my right to do that. And so if there was a group out there that was protecting my free speech, like the Electronic Frontier Foundation, for example, that doesn't, and let's assume that the EFF, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, was getting a bunch of money from Facebook and WordPress and all these platforms that facilitated free speech. Would that make the EFF evil because they were getting money from groups that helped advance people's free speech? Of course not. The same way that it's not evil for a group that defends a civil right to get money regardless of where it comes from. I mean, obviously if it came from like ISIS or something, like that would just be immoral and bad because no one should be accepting blood money from a group. But if there are gun manufacturers who are selling a product that is used to hunt, it's used to defend, it's used to give to police officers, it's obviously a legal enterprise, it's used for our military. If they're selling products and they use their profits to give money to a civil rights organization, that doesn't immediately, by definition, make the organization evil. It's ridiculous to even suggest that the NRA is bad because they got money from gun manufacturers. Who cares? The only time it really matters is if you think that this inanimate object that's a tool is the epitome of all evil and wickedness, and this inanimate object somehow is just the cause of all of the violence in this world. So that was my point on the who cares thing. And the very last thing I just wanted to add was that there's a lot of not a lot, but there are some Parkland High School students and parents of Parkland High School students, of the victims, who are not blaming the NRA, and their arguments are not being heard. I would suggest you go into YouTube and type in White House Parkland High School dad. This guy took a completely different take. The father of one of the Columbine students in the mass shooting in '99 also came out. Again, not an NRA supporter, but saying that it's ridiculous to implicate the NRA when it's simply a civil rights organization. So that's all I got for you today, guys. Today was episode 21. Gun control supporters argue the NRA represents gun manufacturers. That's untrue, and if it were, who cares? You can find me on Stitcher, iTunes, Spotify, and all the major podcast players. If you're not prepared for the worst, get prepared at prepsave.com. That's who pays the bills around here, guys. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. And the next episode will be another gun control argument that I will explain. And again, I challenge you guys, if you disagree with me, if you have evidence that would suggest that I'm wrong or incorrect or mistaken, let me know. I'd love to address it. Don't know what the next one's going to be, but I will be addressing one of either the gun control proposals or something else that the gun control people are saying. This is episode 21. Love you guys. Take care.